Call Marty and Clay at 842-KERN or toll free at 1-800-640-KERN. Now, more of Taking Care of Business on Kern Radio Newstalk 1180.
We are back on Taking Care of Business on Kern Radio Newstalk 1180. We're having a conversation with Congressman Kevin McCarthy. Clay?
Hey, Kevin. Marty and I both have about 2 pages worth of questions, and we're not going to get to even a bit of it. So we want to touch on some things I think that might be of interest to the people. And Marty had a couple of questions regarding your book, Young Guns.
You know, it's funny, Kevin. I really enjoyed the book. I actually read it. And, well, and the reason I say I actually read it is because I think I've probably heard over the last year or so, I've probably heard 15 interviews with you.
Uh-huh.
And I haven't heard that many people ask questions about the book. And I was surprised because you make a lot of great points in that book, and there's a lot of good questions that came out of that book.
But you need a few more pictures.
We didn't do pictures in the book, you know, and the book turned out very well. And we actually did a little book signing this morning. If you look, last week it was the top-selling book at Russo's. In paper, they put the little thing in there because we did one up at the state party.
Mm-hmm.
It's written by 3 of us, by Paul Ryan, Eric Cantor, and myself. All 3 are members of Congress. Paul is the budget chairman. Eric is the number 2 in Congress. He's the majority leader. But we wrote this more than a year ago. We wrote it when we were in the minority in January. And what we wrote it for is we created a program called Young Guns. We didn't pick the name. This is derived from Fred Barnes, the Weekly Standard. He put us on the cover a number of years ago and called us the Young Guns of the Republican Party and said Eric was the leader, Paul was the thinker, and I was the strategist. And the 3 of us kind of got together, and one, we were trying to find ways to solve problems using our conservative views, but also find candidates that could help us get to the majority and think the same way about the solutions. So we went around, we talked. If you read the chapters, we all write like 3 or 4 chapters. We tell a little bit about our life stories that made us our fiscal conservative views. Then we talk about what different problems we have. I'll talk about different candidates that I was recruiting. And I think almost everyone I talk about there ended up winning. And when you think about when we had to write this, wasn't even sure the filing deadline was there. Didn't know if these people would win the primary, let alone the general. And I think every single one of them did.
Mm-hmm. You had some interesting points in your segment of the book, that final segment there. One of the things you mentioned is you were curious why some leaders settle for mediocrity while others continue to try to push the envelope. I thought that was a great statement.
Well, I got frustrated when I ran for Congress. Here were Republicans in majority, and I almost felt like I was running against the Republicans and the Democrats. Republicans were spending too much, ignoring there, and a lot of people in there were just trying to cut a deal. And I thought, why do we settle for this mediocrity when this country is so great? Let's expect exceptionalism and have people rise to the occasion.
Well, and Kevin, you made a good point there, and you made that same point a couple times in the book, which I give you credit for, because you were talking about that loss of trust and that the Republicans were spending out of control, and you made the point that they lost their ideas along the way and they lost their principles. How does the Republican Party get that back? Because even today, looking at the paper today and yesterday, I had a couple of listeners call me up and say, we're not sure the Republicans aren't going to go back to cutting a deal.
Well, the thing I've always found is I thought we did lose our way just because we weren't putting out ideas to solve problems. And one of the biggest challenges we have right now, we've got to know what's before us and what we're dealing with. When the Democrats were in the majority, they never produced a budget, so they only funded government to March 4th. Now, most people don't quite understand. The budget for government ends September 30th, not December 31st. Well, government was only funded to March 4th, so you had to fund government from March 4th to September 30th. The president said we should freeze spending because we had a $1.5 trillion deficit, and they ran it without even having a budget. Well, Republicans said, look, we've only got 6 more months to go, but we think we should start cutting now. So that's why you're hearing about this continuing resolution. But if you're in the middle of something and you want to go through and try to save money, you can't even look at the whole budget. So all we could look at discretionary spending. And the Democrats would attack us and say we're being extreme. Well, discretionary spending in the last 3 years has gone up 83%. Then conservatives out there not realizing that we're not talking about the budget. They said only $61 billion out of a $1.5 trillion deficit. Well, when you're only dealing in a continuing resolution, you can't look at the other things. You don't have the power. So we went to cut what we could, which would be the biggest cut since World War II to government, bigger than anything in 94. All they did was slow the growth of government. They never actually cut. We're actually cutting. And there's a lot of conservatives out there upset from that standpoint because they think it's the budget. Now, next week, we will introduce our budget. That will cut trillions of dollars. And that's really the framework when you can look at everything. Paul Ryan, who wrote the book with me, is the budget chairman. And we'll reform. And he'll show you it's putting us on a path to get to a balanced budget while at the same time paying down the debt. The president, he put out his budget, wouldn't deal with entitlements, even though his debt commission says he needs to. Every year that he doesn't, adds $11 trillion to the unfunded. But for those out there who think Republicans will not keep their pledge, being one, the author of the pledge, I'll tell you, we are keeping the pledge and even going further. The difficulty is the way government was left for Republicans. And remember, we are 1/2 of 1/3 of the government. Democrats have the Senate and they have the White House. But we have been driving further than anybody else.
Are you talking about the way Bush left it, or are you talking about the way it is today, the way Obama's left it?
The way Obama left it. Because, remember, we only took over in January. And let me just give you a little example. Pelosi was the Speaker of the House. When Pelosi was the Speaker and Reid was the leader in the Senate and Obama was the President of the United States, no budget was ever passed, even though they had a majority in every sector, even though they had a large majority, and even though we had a $1.5 trillion deficit. That's the number one thing they should do is pass a budget. They passed Obamacare, but they never passed the budget. So government was not funded. That is the problem in what we're in. And then once we won the majority in November, they took us back into session, and the Democrats passed funding government just to March 4th. And that's part of the debate that people are hearing back, and they're thinking, well, you're not really dealing with the budget in a big number because you can't in a CR. Next week, when you start hearing, and if you watch, I believe Paul's on Fox News Sunday, listen to him tomorrow about what we're going to do in our budget, and people will sit back and say, yes, that is why I voted for Republicans. They're going to put this country back on the right path.
Well, half the Democrats are going to be on the news tomorrow, I understand also, and they've been real vocal, real aggressive, and they seem to have the upper hand.
Well, you know, a lot of time in politics, the president, he gets a bigger microphone, but I think the American people can see through. Democrats maybe had a bigger microphone when they were talking about Obamacare, too, but the majority of Americans don't believe in it.
Well, let me touch on Obamacare for a second, since you brought it up. I understand this past week they passed another a bill or an amendment, 439 pages of new rules and regulations. Do you know anything about that? Well,
they continue to go about from one rulemaking and others. One thing that the Republicans in the House did when they first got in was to repeal Obamacare out of the House. We have to get it out of the Senate. We have stopped funding out of the House for any funding for Obamacare this year because they have set up a lot of different points to start funding it, and a lot of new from exchanges and others, and you find a lot of states are now backing away. And then the thing you will find in our budget, we go after all that future money at the same time. But this is going to be a continual battle week to week until we get to the very end. And this is not a short-term battle. Remember, the president's still sitting there, and the court cases are still going, and the House has a certain version that we know we have repealed, and the Senate is trying to fight us on the other side.
Well, it's been declared unconstitutional by a couple of states. Matter of fact, about 26 states, yeah. And yet the president keeps moving forward and doesn't pay any attention to what the legal system says.
No, he appeals it because he wants to try to jam it through.
And he's doing a good job, unfortunately, Kevin.
Well, he's not over yet.
I hope not. I hope not.
We have made great strides, much further than a lot of people thought we can get so far.
Our guest by phone is Congressman Kevin McCarthy. So, Kevin, basically what you're saying is we're looking at two different fights here, so people don't confuse the two. we're looking at the continuing resolution, but then we're also looking at the actual budget that we're talking about next week. So,
and because of the timing, you had not seen our budget yet.
Right, exactly. So is there a chance we might compromise on the continuing resolution just to get it through, and then really the budget fight is the real fight?
The budget fight is the big fight.
Right.
Now, a couple of different things happen during that time. If the CR does not go through, government shuts down. So you always have to say, what does it mean in a government shutdown? Well, right now you have nothing, because you have different appropriation bills, like for defense and others. They're not passed, so they wouldn't get paid. I've got a concern about our military men and women getting paid. I'd like to see that one signed into law first. Democrats say that they didn't want to cut anything. We've already got $10 billion, but I think we need to go a lot further, and that's why we got to our 61. That's just out of discretionary. I don't see how, from what we're talking about, why they can't agree to the 61 from the standpoint of you're borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar. Every household in America has to tighten their belt, and government should do the same.
Well, my understanding is the Republicans are really the ones, that, at least what the news is saying, the Republicans are the ones that are going to force the government to get shut down, not the Democrats. And Schumer has a whole plan to blame everything on the Republicans.
Well, yeah, Schumer does. And, this week, Schumer had a conference call where he had 4 other senators on there. And he's explaining to the senators, and he thought the press wasn't on the call yet because they're going to be on the call. And he's going through the talking points. Call the Republicans extreme. Go all these talking points of how to blame us, and then someone said, the press is on the call, and he just shut up. Well, I say this. The first thing that people should know, look, the first way I learned about politics was a young kid on Saturday morning. I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. Remember that?
No.
And they tell you the fundamental way a bill becomes a law, that the House writes a bill and the Senate writes a bill. Then there's a conference, and you decide, and then it's voted on both houses.
Well, that's that kid's book.
That's a simple way to understand it. Well, let's look at what has transpired since then. The Democrats last year never produced anything, so we don't have one. Come in. The House has passed the bill and sent it to the Senate. The Senate has not acted. The president said he wanted to negotiate, so he sent the vice president down, and they had a meeting. Vice president met one day and then left for 2 weeks. So we were at a point where government was going to shut down. So Republicans passed a short-term CR while we negotiated that cut $2 billion a week. Why we picked $2 billion a week is if it went all the way through, it would be over $61 billion, the exact same as the full bill. So you either eat your meal in one big bite or you take smaller bites about it. That's what we're going at. For every time Democrats didn't want to negotiate it, we got another piece of our bill, another piece of our bill. People are frustrated with that process. You want to make sure you get it done all the way. So now we're kind of at the break point. Democrats in the Senate have never produced a bill. So all they're doing is sitting back playing politics, just blaming the Republicans. When the Republicans produced what they want, how do you negotiate with yourself? You ever walk in to buy a car or a house and you make an offer and then no one says anything back to you? Mm-hmm. So you're supposed to sit there and keep lowering your offer?
Sure, exactly. Kevin, let's pick it up there when we come back. We're having a conversation with Congressman Kevin McCarthy on taking care of business on Kern Radio Newstalk 1180.